Hello, everyone. My name is Virginie Guiraudon. I'm the convener of this first and perhaps last virtual conference of the Standing Group on the European Union. As you know, this conference was first postponed, so we should all have been in Rome in June 2020. But as you know, all roads lead to Rome eventually. So we'll meet in Rome for sure next year in mid-June 2022. But we already had a very, very impressive program. We have more than 20 sections on all aspects of EU studies. So we thought it would be impossible to postpone one more year and not meet again. So it's not ideal, of course. We do not have the coffee breaks, the aperitivi, the nice evenings together, and the same exchange. At the same time, while projects, continued, and I'm thinking also of our young colleagues who are, of course, who have to present their work, who have to get exposure on their research and make contacts. So we thought it would be important to have this conference, even if it's online. So I thank Thomas Christiansen, the former chair of this group, and who was a convener in Rome with Sergio Fabbrini, who is in this roundtable, for doing all the groundwork basically for this conference. We added, in fact, a section on COVID-19, but it's very much the program that we thought about. What I want to say is just to welcome you. I hope everything went well today. We still have a full day and a half of conference with a lot of different panels. I still think that we were just very happy to meet again and discuss projects related to European integration, EU studies in a very broad sense, because that's also something that's very important to our standing group. Is we take the EU in its broadest, I would say, political science, sociological sense. So are a lot of panels, and as usual, some of them are on very specific topics, policy areas or institutions or issues. And what really the purpose of this plenary roundtable today is to get a broader picture, a more perhaps also theoretical picture of EU studies at this point from just 4 outstanding scholars in the field. So these are not just people who have always contributed to EU studies, but also very well-known scholars of comparative politics and international relations as well, so that we can, I think, take this opportunity to see where the field is going based on what we've experienced individually, collectively, as individuals in very different member states. So I don't think we had a collective experience. We probably had different experiences of the last 18 months and COVID. What I've asked them is 2 things. Is first to actually reflect on how they analyzed what's happened when the global pandemic hit Europe in early 2020, and the decisions that were made both by member states and at the EU level, and then in a second time to see whether it's changed or it's influenced the way that they envisage the European integration process. We'll have a second round of presentations, which will be more based on the last 18 months. Should we somehow think of new or modified research agendas and take into account what has happened during this COVID-19 pandemic and the policy responses that followed. So it's my great honor, as I said, to welcome 4 scholars. I'll just briefly state, I'm not going to go into their bios because you can look them up and you know them already. But of course, Sergio Fabbrini, who is Professor of Politics and International Relations and Intesa San Paolo Chair of European Governments at LUIS in Rome. Markus Jachtenfuchs, who is Professor of European and Global Governance and Director of the Jacques Delors Center at the Hertie School in Berlin. Brigid Laffan, who's the Director, of course, of the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute in Florence. And Kalypso Nicolaidis, who is also in Florence right now as the Chair of International Affairs at the School of Transnational Governance, on leave from St. Anthony's College, Oxford. We will start the first round of presentation, and ladies first. It's, sorry, I'm very old school. It's my French 20th century bourgeois education. So I'm very happy first to yield the floor to Brigid Laffan, then to Kalypso Nicolaidis, Sergio Fabbrini, and Markus Jachtenfuchs for a first round of about 7 or 8 minutes of presentation. So Brigid, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Virginie. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. And given the broad remit you gave us, I suspect we're going to have very different contributions, and all the richer for that. I will focus in my first contribution on how I read one EU response to the pandemic, and in fact, the issues about the field and future research agenda I take up in my second contribution. So firstly, because I am the first speaker, let me take you all back to January 2020. The EU had managed the transition post the 19 elections. There was a new commission in place, a new president of the European Council, and all of the other roles were in place. There was also remarkable congruence between the political priorities of President von der Leyen and the heads of state strategic agenda that had started in 2016 with Bratislava. And that agenda was very much Green Deal, Europe and the digital world, technological change, the social and political economy, future of work and all that went with that, and then Europe's role in the world. And for me, this period, there was a glimpse of what I would call the horizon was strategic for the EU again. It was not unlike the period of the mid-1980s single market and the single market, that Grand Projet 92, and also the Single European Act. There were shared challenges, shared problems, but also, at least at a meta level, a shared trajectory. But then the pandemic hits, and it hits so quickly after all of this new commission got its feet under their desks, and the EU struggles, as it always does initially when faced with a crisis. And the EU was back to what Luc van Middelaar calls the politics of events. In other words, improvisation and response. And the EU was very much back in crisis mode. And crisis or crises have typically two meanings. One is a crisis is a time of extreme uncertainty, difficulty and danger, where political actors must respond. There's urgency and emergency. So that's the immediate pressure of a crisis. But crisis also has a second meaning, and that is crisis as turning point, when the significant outcomes are revealed in retrospect. And I think it is fair to say that the EU, certainly the pandemic has been the first kind of crisis. It was urgent, it was extreme, and it required action. And what the legacy of this crisis will be, in my view, will be revealed in retrospect and over time. But there is a potential, at least, for that second sense of the pandemic as being a turning point. So then moving on to the EU's response, I would use my time to look at the significant change in the budgetary politics of the EU. And the power of the purse distinguishes the EU as a polity above the level of the state from international organizations. Although its budgetary resources, public finance resources, are small, they're still much larger and produce more public goods than is usual for anything above the level of the state. And since the budget treaties of 70 and 75, budgetary politics has been driven by one dominant cleavage, and that cleavage, net beneficiary versus net contributors, with second order cleavages on friends of CAP, friends of cohesion, versus new policy areas in response to new challenges that the EU faced. And so it was with the MFF of 21-27 as late as February. That dominant cleavage was the cleavage driving the budgetary negotiations. And then all changed. Between March 20 and July 20, we had a fundamental shift. So how do we explain this shift? Well, I would begin with Gurevich and politics of hard times. Policy needs politics, that crises they disturb existing coalitions and relationships, and they make both politics and policy more fluid. In other words, he calls them open moments when you can have system change and new policy choices. And so how does the politics of the pandemic in terms of the EU work out? And I have what I call three different kinds of politics. The first politics I would call the entangled politics, and that is the marble cake politics of this multi-level system. And that had numerous dimensions. Firstly, the demand for solidarity from the EU by member states, and in this case, particularly by Italy. It was really the demand was insistent and recurrent. Secondly, a shifting coalition across the member states. And here I think of major significance was a letter sent to the European Council by 9 countries in March. And that it called for a mutualized debt instrument. And it wasn't just the Mediterranean countries, so Spain, Italy, Greece, and Portugal, but also Slovenia, Belgium, France, and Ireland. And in other words, there was a crack in the dominant budgetary coalition at that time. And the letter called for a common debt instrument. It said we face an external shock. No country bears responsibility. In other words, try to overcome the moral hazard narrative which had bedeviled the Eurozone crisis. And it must be of sufficient size and long maturity to be efficient. So in other words, there was agenda setting, and particularly I think France by driving this letter as it did and breaking with Berlin in terms of not coalescing with Berlin on it was very significant. And then of course, by May, you had the Franco-German demand where you had France and Germany a major shift in German preferences on 2 issues, one, mutualized debt, and secondly, on grants. And this was the speed with which German preferences shifted was very significant. And so you were left with opposition to the frugal 4. So opposition was small countries, rich countries. And also, of course, there was an absence in these negotiations, and that absence was very significant, and that was the absence of the United Kingdom, because I see no circumstances, given the work I've done on budgetary politics, that the EU could ever have agreed a la 28 what was eventually agreed. So I think that absence mattered. So that's the entangled politics. Then there was the institutional politics, the roles and responsibilities of the different institutions. And here, of course, the European Council was the driver. It was the institution that asked the Commission and the President of the Council to start working on a roadmap, an action plan, and also an unprecedented recovery plan. So European Council, chef Zaka, demanding a response. But because it coincided with the MFF negotiations, the Commission could insert itself in the policy choice and problem-solving arena. And essentially, very quickly after they were given the request for a roadmap, within 24 hours, von der Leyen came out and said, we linked the recovery package to the MFF and the Commission will deliver a second package. And so by May, the Commission had done all of the homework, and its proposal, its MFF proposal, and also New Generation EU was on the New Generation EU was a major shift in terms of what they had put on the table in in February that had failed. And then we go back then to the Chefsache, to the long interminable European Council, where you have final agreement on what is and must be recognized as a historic agreement in terms of this is the largest use of public funding and the power of the purse that the EU has ever embarked on. Now, what it leads to and the legacy, that Hamiltonian moment or not, I think has to be revealed in retrospect. It's far too early. But the entangled politics and the institutional politics, and that has then led to what will be another form of politics, and that is the intensification of multi-level governance when it comes to implementing all of these programs across all of these states. And unlike the period of austerity, the EU has there are incentives on the table. It's not austerity, there are incentives, and it's become much more like a contract between the collective EU and each member state on their recovery plans and their recovery the future. And so I think that that also alters the dynamic of multi-level governance in the EU, but of course we will see how the Commission operates, how it reviews the plans, and how much of the kind of cohesion governance model survives, or is this a new form of governance that will emerge in the EU? So I leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Brigid. We delved right in the concrete and unprecedented decisions of the last year. Thank you very much. I now yield the floor to Kalypso Nicolaidis.
Thank you, Virginie, and it's wonderful that Brigid set the scene in such an effective way, because I want to go straight on to your question to us from there. You know, is there going to be a before and after COVID, not just for the EU, but for EU studies, aside from being totally zoomed out and we'll never want to do a Zoom meeting again? No, that's not true. So I would like to make 2 points, and in a way, asking a question to all our peers who are listening, who've been in wonderful sessions and will continue tomorrow. And I guess that the 2 points, the first is to ask ourselves if this pandemic moment, is it a case for EU studies, or is it a moment, Hamiltonian or otherwise, paradigm shift? Because we all have a tendency to look at any new event as this one through our own conceptual priors, and then more or less of a tendency to have a bit of Bayesian updating. But if we're theoretical, we believe our theories should be resilient. So if it's a case, it shouldn't really change our lenses. So which one is it, as it were? And so you ask us to reflect on our own work, and I would say that if we look at the EU as a polity, and a lot of my work has been on this, and what is COVID crisis a case of, and what does it do to the policy? And Brigid spoke to this a moment ago, but there's been great sessions already here in ECPR on policy areas, but also the crisis and Europeanization of public sphere. Now, one point that I think is interesting is that the publics in Europe have consistently distinguished between the what and the how of EU policy and polity. There, on the what side, there's been very little doubt that they, under COVID, as before, they have supported the functional need of doing more together. And in this case, more on health, but also more on welfare, etc. And indeed, not just because of functional considerations of economies of scale, but because the narrative of solidarity has changed. And EU studies have already showed that, brilliant polls on how publics relate differently to symmetric shock with asymmetric effect, and really dampened moral hazard problems, because this is more like a volcano than anybody being at fault. And so on the what side, we study how there's support for more EU action, more centralization, etc. But we also see in parallel the doubt on the speed and form of centralization, and on the way in which, and including on what is considered by many as a, if not a failure, but not great achievement of the EU, at least in dealing with the vaccine and all of this. And maybe people understand, Europeans understand that what we have today, what we see better than ever before is that Europe is not just levels of governance, but overlapping circles of autonomy. And that sometimes your town and your région in France or whatever is a better, more effective circle of autonomy. And we've just seen it together and seen ourselves seeing it. And maybe there, I mean, my own work on democracy and the need normatively to stay on the Rubicon, is relevant, because it's about whenever you centralize more in terms of competence, you need to anchor it democratically and to consider polycentric governance. So this is just to say that we have this kind of question of Bayesian updating of our theories. But at the same time, I would say that maybe some of us, and myself included, hopefully are encouraged to use completely new lens, new conceptual lens. I have myself been led to think about this R, the reproduction rate, and whether and how in different countries there are different types of social imaginations and social appropriation of R, societies appropriate R, and the relationship between states and society in this context is changing. We want more state and we want more society at the same time. That's a bit the COVID paradox. Led me to reread Castoriadis, The Self-Institution of Society, but also, Membe's Necropolis, because it's interesting to compare what I call theaters of war and theaters of care in Europe. Very different leadership frame of Europe. So maybe here, suddenly with a crisis like this, I'm thinking about what is democratic imagination in Europe. Others have thought about this before me, but suddenly we use new lens, and this is great too. So this is what we do about our own kind of updating conceptually. And of course, you each have different responses to this question. And then my second point very quickly, Virginie, is to ask, who decides and how we decide on the degree of relevance, of porousness of what we do vis-a-vis a crisis like this. In some areas that we have seen completely new industries, scholarly industries. And indeed, you said, Virginie, there was a whole panel on impact and reaction between member states. Now, myself, I'm a consumer of these studies, but wow, how fascinating. So many variables to change and to compare across for the next few years on comparative policies across the board, across different, in different scope, different contexts. But then I ask, okay, what will be our time span? Who decides what the relevant time span is, or comparators? And we are watching. So I'm not doing it, but we're going to be watching this new industry. So there are those who have completely renewed our EU studies because of COVID. Then there is the range of areas, and I was looking at these ECPR panels, where we just simply have to acknowledge how relevant COVID is, but we come at it with a baggage. And of course, Brigid just cited the comparative political economy. Comparative political economy meets IPE, where of course the arrival of the new kid on the block, the recovery fund, forces us to consider anew all the debates on MU, fiscal union, own resources. Of course, the continuity of functionalist considerations overriding autonomy angst, all of these things. But this massive use of fiscal firepower for non-fiscal goals is relatively new in Europe. It raises the issue discussed in several panels of, the new different societal stakeholders and the new types of of understanding of capitalism and Europe's role in mitigating capitalism in the EU, the role of conditionality. I myself just published a little book on rule of law conditionality and asking to what extent in this new era conditionality needs to be owned by citizens and by societies. So there's a whole set of issues that are kind of rejigged. And then similarly, and to finish, on external relations, we have a number of panels, but either on the EU's contribution to the new multilateralism, where clearly the EU needs to continue with past agendas that we've all been studying, but also broaden its aperture even more broadly than before on new types of issues, disruptive issues that have been at the forefront with the COVID crisis, disruptive technology, etc. But also, how do you reshape ideas on soft power in a world where it's all about regulatory cooperation on intellectual property, on supply chain, etc. And how do we reconcile this with ideas of kind of unilateral Brussels effect, benign as they were? Maybe this is not really possible anymore. And finally, of course, issues where we have seen several panels dear to my heart on the need to decenter our foreign policy. And in a world where what happens, in any country around the world on COVID affects us directly, more than ever before, we need to decenter our approach to European foreign policy. And I think I've seen many wonderful ECPR panel doing this.
Thank you very much, Kalypso. So I've noted down Gurevich and Castoriadis. So I was well trained in comparative politics and sociology. They were mentioned at this point. Thank you very, very much, Kalypso. And now I turn to Sergio Fabbrini from Louis University.
Okay, thanks very much, Virginie. In order to control myself, I use a PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint try to explain what I saw in the 2020 pandemic political process. And of course, a very complex organization like the EU does not change overnight. However, important policy change emerged in the 2020. I stopped my analysis with the meeting of the European Council in December 2020. So my two research questions concern how did the pandemic affect the political process of last year, and how to explain the main policy outcome of the 2020 political process, namely Next Generation EU. It seems to me that there is something new, of course, but also many things that are already established. The very first question led me to answer that, at least for the very first time, I consider the formation of structural coalition along the main fault line during the 2020 pandemic. Of course, you have already coalition in the European Union, but they were persistent in different situations, in different fault line, and they were kept together by distinct policy discourses and led by recognized policy entrepreneur. This is why I found useful for this analysis to use discursive institutionalism, because that helps us to understand better how a coalition function and how the coalition interact with other coalition. At the same time, discursive institution is not sufficient for understanding why those coalitions emerged in the first place and continued to be persistent for the entire political process of the last year. Here, the two main narratives on political and policy change, the intergovernmental and the functional, are useful, but in my view insufficient, because if you consider the intergovernmental approach, the negotiation between states, which was evident, however, the negotiation between states was structured by a group of states, not by minimum size coalition looking for the minimum common denominator policy outcome. Indeed, here we have very different negotiation logic organized around group of member states rather than single member state. Also, the functional narrative is useful. Nevertheless, there are some elements that do not persuade. It was not a debate or division between intergovernmental institution and supranational institution. Indeed, the Commission play a very important role, but the Commission play a role within the division that already taking place and emerging in the European Council and the ECOFIN Council. So the Commission stood with a specific group, with a specific coalition against another coalition. So there is something new, it seems to me, in the political process of last year. I don't know if it is going to last, but it will be interesting to understand and to follow. So the first division was a division concerning the interpretation of the crisis. This is obvious. It happens always when there is a crisis, and the Frugal Coalition immediately advanced this idea of an asymmetrical crisis, and what they call the Solidarity Coalition, which was mainly a French-led coalition. The role of Macron in this coalition was very crucial, strategic. The Solidarity Coalition instead imposed the idea that there was a symmetrical crisis of which none can be considered responsible. And then you have the formation of a sovereignty coalition, was always there, Hungary and Poland. They play a second, let's say, a second place role in this debate, and they backed the symmetrical interpretation of the crisis. After the interpretation of the crisis, you have the discussion on and the division on the governance. And again, you have the same coalition opposing each other regarding how to govern the crisis. The Frugal Coalition was clearly intergovernmental, consistent intergovernmental, where the Solidarity Coalition defended a mixed approach, very, let's say, congenial with the Eurozone view that we have to combine intergovernmental but also important role for the Commission. Indeed, the Commission was allowed to play this important role, although there was this criticism of the Commission coming from the Frugal Coalition, in particular from the Dutch. The Dutch were not critical with the Southern Coalition, as they used to call, or with the Italian. They were basically critical with the Commission. And again, here, the Sovereignty Coalition support the intergovernmental governance. You see that the third coalition, Hungary and Poland, was more, let's say, opportunistic and try to use one of the other side for promoting his own view. And then you have a division on the question of how to finance how to finance the next generation EU. And again, here you have a consistent, persistent opposition between the Frugal and the Solidarity all along the debate that took place in those months. And then finally, we have a final division which concerns the conditionality rule of law. And in this case, however, the Frugality and the Solidarity Coalition came to coalesce against the view of the Sovereignty Coalition that opposed veto to the idea of that conditionality criteria. So here, I don't want to judge. I don't turn in the content of the division, but again, what I found interesting, for at least from my perspective, is that you have this division, which in some way follow the main fault line of the debate. You have a division on the interpretation of the crisis, on the governance of the crisis, on the resources for dealing with the pandemic. And in all these divisions, you have the same group of member states led by the most prominent leader of the coalition. And that division was permanent, persistent, consistent. Where, for example, in the division between North and South, in the Eurozone crisis, or the division between East and West in the migration crisis of the last decade, you had one clear, let's say, communicative coalition, and the other coalition, the South vis-a-vis the North, or the East vis-a-vis the West, were more, let's say, against the predominant position, but without being able to elaborate an alternative view. The South during the Eurozone crisis asked for flexibility, the other for closing the border. This was not the case in the 2020. And again, the rule of law, you have a different interpretation of the division, which was persistent. So my conclusion is that certainly you can use intergovernmental or functional approach. However, this 2020 political process should probably show that there are a pre-existing configuration of sub-region, section that tend to be mobilized when very important issue, challenge or threat, the identity or the functional need of the member state of this area. So just to bring a new, let's say, integration to our predominant theory, that probably we can use sectionalism or sub-regionalism for better understanding the outcome of the pandemic process, or the political process activated by the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sergio. This was very enlightening. You've done your I told you to be analytical and reflexive, and that's exactly what you did. You already have the model on the PowerPoint to give us food for thought. And now I will yield the floor to Markus Jachtenfuchs from the Hertie School of Governance in.
Yeah, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to this panel. It's a great honor to be a part of that discussion. And I try in my first part to do what Virginie asked us to do, namely to propose some reflective analytical perspective on basically what did I learn on the basis of my previous work from the COVID crisis, and whether it challenged existing scholarly understandings of the EU. So in terms of the ongoing work, that is my work together with Philipp Genschel on core state power. This idea is that core state powers are the action resources really that the modern state needs to function, or that modern policies need to function. That is force, administration, but also fiscal capacity. And obviously, when we look at what happened, it appears that the crisis has led to a real boost in the fiscal capacity of the EU, not only Next Generation EU, the Recovery and Resilience Facility. We should also not forget that the ECB really opened the floodgates. What was really highly controversial at Mario Draghi's initial whatever it takes speech with Christine Lagarde became basically the rule. The ECB supports everybody who is somehow has some problems. So we have a drastic increase of the EU's fiscal capacity. Really, Brigid mentioned this. This is the biggest package that the EU has ever adopted in its entire history. What is also interesting to see analytically is that on first sight, it's a difficult case, or it was a difficult case. You know, this was redistributive bargaining because somebody has to give and others have to take. It's clear. Huge sums were on the table. This was not the coffee who pays for the coffee break, but these were enormous astronomical sums really. It was high salience in the public, that was in everybody's mind. There was also controversy. We should not forget that the coalitions that Sergio just alluded to really fought against each other. There were probably not only interest coalitions in the sense of that I want to get as much money out of that and pay as little into it as possible, but also really worldviews. The frugals, I think, and the solidarity and the sovereignty worldviews, to stay with Sergio, were not just interest. There were really ideas about how the EU should function. So this was a difficult initial condition. There were also facilitating conditions, which we should not overlook in the final solution. First of all this is temporary. We should really not forget this when we think about Hamiltonian moments and great new steps in the fiscal architecture of the European Union. It is temporary. And to the degree that I can assess this when I listen to people who probably know much more about the technicalities than I do, I think it is indeed temporary. There is no loophole. There is nothing that will get us out of this and that the next generation EU will somehow be prolonged easily. The second thing is it has long payback periods, so we put a lot of money on the table now and we pay it back in the decades to come when many of us will be long dead. So that eases the things. The third thing that eases conditions very much for all of what happens and what I think all of us surprised probably. I mean, I have to say, at least subjectively, I thought, finally, the EU is back on the agenda. It does something. It gets its act together and it really does what is actually needed and is not tied to enormous distributive bargainings and negative headlines, So, and probably the most important facilitating conditions, which we should also not forget when we try to generalize from this and when we try not to become over optimistic in terms of the bright new future of the EU here, is that is the problem type. It's this natural disaster problem type, that is really important for public support and it's important for mobilization. We do not have any moral hazard. It's clearly an external crisis. It's symmetrical. We have clear collective benefits. And as a result, there are no inherent limits to solidarity. So in that sense, despite the huge redistributive aspect of it, despite the huge sums, this is the most easy situation. Yeah, that's what it was. A natural disaster. We are all in that together. There's clearly no fault discourse, or those who tried to start a fault discourse didn't really get it through. So in that sense, it was an easy type. What we should also not forget in this picture and in our pleasure that we probably have, and I think rightly so, about this fiscal surge, is the rebordering aspects of Schengen. We've seen what we've seen already in the refugee crisis, the enormous political importance of rebordering, this raising of the closing of the borders as if the virus would start at borders. We've seen a great, I think, national security mobilization. We should not forget that, because security is not only the protection that the government gives us against an external attack, it's also the security that it gives us against the deadly virus. And I think governments seize the opportunity. We should not forget this. So we have this duality of the debordering really of solidarity or of the rebordering of the Schengen era. What that means theoretically, I think it's a new perspective on post-functionalism. We should not see post-functionalism in a caricatural way that it says there's constraining dissensus everywhere, in every issue area. But I think what post-functionalism seems to postulate, and what many have postulated in this sense early on, Dahl has done this, others has done this, there's this scale community trade-off. I mean, the more we increase the scale of governance, the more problematic becomes the community support for this. And I think what we have seen in that crisis is that that need not necessarily and easily to be the case. We can have a trans-border solidarity. We can have a kind of European community in the sense of a community of solidarity in this very specific case. That is a sign of hope, and I think it's a theoretically justified sign of hope. Solidarity in that sense is issue specific rather than community specific. And I think that bears great significance for all our debates about the social preconditions for democracy in the EU, this idea that somehow the national communities are still there and so on and so forth. It also means that political agency is possible. One can really orchestrate a coalition around these types of policy measures. It's not easy, it's hard, redistributive bargaining, but there is a way out of the trap of the constraining dissensus in that way. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Markus. Thank you for mentioning borders. Typically, this is also a case so that you've mentioned, all of you, that it's not necessarily about dichotomies, right? You can have cross-border solidarity and rebordering at the same time, and I think that's also one of the points that Kalypso raised in another way. Multi-level governance is just not layers, it's a bit more entangled. So I go to the second part. The second part is, already I asked you something difficult, which was indeed to reflect on your past work and as a tool of analysis. And you've already actually have answered part of the second part, which is about where do we go from there? Does that open up new avenues for EU studies? If I can sum up what I think Kalypso was trying to say is, yes, we can go the old conservative way and just say we've got the models and we just say it's all about past dependence. So of course, each country will react according to the past. It's a caricature, but she also said, well, there are, and of course many the other speakers on this panel also said, well, there is something new and there is something, somehow, there are shifting coalitions. We don't know if they are lasting or not, or there are new types of decisions. So in the second round, the question I asked the speakers and that they'll answer now is, where do we go from there in scholarly terms? Are there new, it's not just about, of course, changing our theoretical framework, but also about asking perhaps new questions. And also something that has been barely mentioned here is, I think it was mentioned by Brigid, is the fact that many of the areas concerned by COVID, by the way, there is no EU competence. So it's very indirect, but that doesn't mean it's not real. I work, for instance, on long-term care, and clearly this is not an EU competence, but there are lobbies, associations at the EU level, very, very operational, and trying to work very much on that. So I think this, I thought you would perhaps address it if beyond the macroeconomic issues or even the recovery package, the fact that some of these issues questioned areas where there were no obvious EU competence, which may be of interest to, I think, to our EU scholars. So we start the second round with Markus, actually, and we're working our way back now through our round of speaker.
Okay, thank you very much. On the prospects of research, I mean, I do not make myself any illusions whether anybody else will take up what I think would be an interesting perspective of research, but I try to make an argument. Before I do this, let me just briefly react to what Virginie said. I would be very surprised if the EU wouldn't seize the opportunity to get into the crisis, to get into some of the fields that it hasn't been really in before. And I mean, I think this is really a path dependencies that we see. It's a typical issue of crisis politics. We see a crisis, we see a reaction, and something happens. Clearly, we have seen a kind of European action deficit, and somehow I think it will get into it. That gets us, I think, to a system of, you can call it comparative federalism, where in more and more fields, the EU and the member states have to act together. And I think that is significant for the system as a whole, But seen from my perspective in this broader, it's not only a fiscal perspective. I think the big problem that is important for the EU is how to overcome what you could call the regulatory straitjacket. That is obviously borrowing a little bit from Danny Roderick. He's called it the golden straitjacket. I think in the EU, that straitjacket is not so golden. That's the problem. And the problem is that the EU regulates national core state powers, in that sense, mainly fiscal capacities, there's a long literature whether the European semester and the stability growth pact and all that is really effective, but it does somehow interfere politically. You know, with Next Generation EU, we have this kind of gigantic Horizon 2020 that we all know in the research field. We now have it for the member states. You know, they've all to submit their programs. They have to be checked by the Commission and so on. Some national parliaments also think they check them. But I think what the real issue here is that the EU regulates what the member states can do with their money, but it's not strong enough still for providing so much help, solution, or economies of scale, you know, because after all, we know that the EU budget, even with Next Generation EU and the RRF, is still relatively small. And that creates an opportunity structure for politicization and for the constraining dissensus. We are still, I think, in that world where domestic political actors, domestic political parties can mobilize against the EU straitjacket. It's difficult for them to do so as long as the EU opens the floodgates of money and pours money over everybody. You know, to be against this is not so easy. But as soon as this will be more asymmetrical, this old structure is still there. And that, I think, is a self-reinforcing system, which is deeply and inherently unstable, and that is a major problem. You know, and that hasn't been changed in the pandemic. You know, it has just been changed in the sense that there's now a lot of money, you know, which is good. In that sense, this is distributive politics, the implementation, which is good. So the first agenda for me would be to think about the capacity regulation trade-off for heterogeneous policy. You know, we will not see state making big budgets or something like this in the foreseeable future in the EU. We will rather have to think about which types of institutions and control the EU will evolve. Will this be, as Brigid seemed to have conceived of, another reinforcement of multi-level governance? We have a working together of the EU level and of the member state level in the implementation, a kind of contract. I think it may be an intergovernmental supranational mixture, and I think that sounds very plausible that this is, but echoing a little bit what Kalypso said, what does this mean for political agency and what does it mean for political accountability? And there, I'm not so sure whether this creates an opportunity structure for big political dissensus, you know, which I think we need somehow in the political, in the European Union to make it more resonating with people, to make it more accountable in one way or another. The second thing is a more theoretical research agenda, again, not to be over optimistic on the crisis and think about the crisis in perspective. And that is reflecting about the scope conditions for function versus community, which for me is the big dividing line in the theoretical debate on the EU today. Functional approaches who basically think, well, the EU is still an institution for collective problem solving. It's basically a rational utility maximizing entity or institution, or the community logic, which has a lot to do with national or other identities and feelings of community. You know? What we can see in that crisis is very clearly that functional pressures were very high in many crises, in the Eurozone crisis, in the refugee crisis, in the COVID crisis. So there was a clear European value added in that respect, but it was not so easily forthcoming, and which I think is still the functional problem of the European Union. Community importance was highly different in COVID for the reason that I tried to highlight. They were relatively positive because this was a solidaristic thing, but overall the provision of community, I think, is relatively limited, you know, and that is what we should think about. Where can we, there's this literature on solidarity in the European Union. I think somehow the EU needs that, you know, and solidarity is a word that is very often used with highly normative connotations. It's with a lot of hope. It reminds you of the welfare state and all that. But I think the EU has clearly left this old idea of the market regulating polity and how we can orchestrate and organize solidarity under these conditions of extreme heterogeneity, of incentives to mobilize against this as soon as we enter the era of non-natural hazard crisis, I think is really important for the EU to understand. And again, I leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Markus. My voice is back. Sergio, it's your turn to take us to the future of the future of Europe. As you know, this famous process has started already. but the future of EU studies in our case.
I don't know about the future of European Union studies. I try to understand what is the future of my research, and I try to think about the logical development of what I said before. The first point concerns the nature of politics in general within the European Union. I think it deserves to be tested where we are moving in the direction of more lasting coalition rather than shifting coalition. And I think this movement, if we have this kind of movement over lasting coalition, would indicate a sort of sub-regionalization of the European Union rather than the classical interstate organization of the European Union. Here, the crucial point, at least in my research, is Germany. Germany was stood with the frugal coalition at the beginning of the pandemic in the interpretation of the crisis, and then to a certain point moved to what I call the solidarity coalition. Why Germany moved in the solidarity coalition is an open question, according to some scholar, and I think I tend to buy this interpretation. It depended on the persuasive capacity of Mr. Macron in showing the necessity for Germany to support the 9 leaders letter and giving to the European Union an independent fiscal capacity. But probably there are also domestic factors. The fear by the economic sector of Germany of being penalized by a deepening of the let's say negative condition in the south. The role of the German Federal Constitutional Court, the fact that the German Constitutional Court push the, let's say, national intergovernmental view to its extreme, and what happened yesterday when the Commission decided to criticize, to make an appeal to that decision of the Constitutional Court is an example of the fact that Germany should take a position. It depends on the new next September election. Probably there will be some change. There will be probably a serious debate within the CDU. I don't. The position by Mr. Schäuble is being criticized by other CDU leaders. So here, Germany is an important question. It seems to me that France, if we are going to see the confirmation of Mr. Macron, will be on this what they call solidarity side, and will use the solidarity coalition for increasing its influence vis-a-vis Germany. Anyway, this is the first question. Are we moving in the direction of the formation of section or sub-region, as we found in federal system by aggregation, where you have pre-existing functional need, identity configuration that emerge when the process of federalization tend to deepen, which is the case in particular of the US. The second point is, if that is true, or if that is plausible, let's say more than that is true, which could be the implication of this intercoalition, let's say, divide or sectional divide for the governance system of the European Union. The growth of the European Council as the predominant holistic institution was motivated by the fact that the European Council is able to deliberate, to mediate, to look for trade-off, making everybody, roughly speaking, happy. of course, the experience of the 2020 showed that this is not the case. In the 2020, there were loser and winner, and the frugal were on the side of the loser, not on the winner. And of course, they received something in exchange, but they did not reach the main target of their action to make impossible Next Generation EU. So I think this will create trouble to the European Council, and probably will also open room of maneuvering for the Commission. That will be probably the possibility for the Commission to regain some of the lost power that the Commission accepted to lose, by the way, in many cases. And also during this 2020, as far as I was able to understand the crisis, there were members of the Commission that sided with the frugal coalition and tried to stop the most advanced position, namely the position, let's say, advanced by commissioners like Breton and Gentiloni. So here, again, I think the 2020 process, political process, showed that probably there will be some change on the relation between the Intergovernmental European Council, which really increases on power in a very unlimited way. And also I found responsibility also on the side of the scholar, of the European Union scholar, in justifying the role of the European Council, to the point that the European Council now try to play also a judicial role. The declaration, the conclusion of the December 10-11 December of the last year, even the European Council say to the Court of Justice, European Court of Justice, how to interpret the regulation on rule of law. This is really a serious handicap, threat for the development of the European Union. And so I think that the coalition divide might help to reduce the power of the European Council and to open up reflection on the role of this, what I call the elephant in the room. The third point is, yes, Next Generation EU is clearly an ad hoc temporary program. Fine, it couldn't be differently. However, it lasts 6 years, and there are several positions, particularly within the Solidarity Coalition, that say that after the Next Generation EU, we need to open up a discussion, particularly, say, concerning the Stability and Growth Pact, the going back to the old fiscal rule, that cannot be simply renovated or reopened or restarted as something of the past. In the meanwhile, not only the public debt of countries like Italy, but also France, many other countries, is much more higher than the 60% GDP and so forth. So here, I would think not to be, let's say, or at least not to be too realistic as a king. You have to, there is a discussion, the discussion on the Stability and Growth Pact reform, on the Eurozone reform, on the European semester reform, should be considered in a larger framework. And again, probably Next Generation EU can be considered an ad hoc program. Nevertheless, it seems difficult for the European Union, or at least for the Eurozone, to go on without some significant limited fiscal capacity at the center. And when you start, or you, for example, like now, you set up a fiscal administration within the Commission, that the Commission never had a fiscal administration. When you start an institutionalization of the process, it is not easy to say now, let's go back. And again, this brings me to the 4 points. Next Generation EU, it is not important to discuss about the Miltonian interpretation of the Next Generation EU. I try to criticize the ordoliberal interpretation of Hamilton, which is based on nothing, mistakes, wrong interpretation of US history, as I wrote in my criticism of Mr. Schauble. Hamilton did not anticipate the Stability and Growth Pact, it introduced something else. However, this is not a crucial question for scientific debate. For scientific debate is, can the European Union, as Markus said, face new challenges, environmental challenges, technological challenges, without the possibility to generate public goods? Because Next Generation EU is basically an attempt to support national goods, not European goods. And we need to find some way for, let's say, constructing at the center of the European Union, in the Commission, in the Parliament, in the Council, the instrument for dealing with those challenges and to create public goods. And again, my impression is that that is a sort of turning point. But of course, I don't want to push too much, but here the model of European Union democracy is crucial. If we remain to the idea that the European Union is a sum of member states, we don't have a solution to that. We need to separate rather than to fuse. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sergio, for your enthusiastic and passionate statement at the end. And I'm sure Kalypso is going to pick up on this democratic issue as well, in one way or another. Kalypso, c'est à toi.
Virginie, oui, tu nous as demandé, you asked us how you think the pandemic should guide future research agendas of EU studies. And my first reaction in reading your question was, well, you know, scholars should do, our students and ourselves, whatever we're interested in. I always tell my students, you know, you should be Sherlock Holmes. And when you wake up in the morning, want to do this. So it's what you're passionate and fascinated by. But putting on my IR hat and knowing that I was sharing the panel with Sergio, Markus, and Brigid, I thought, well, maybe what I want to state very quickly is what I think the three big categories of questions facing us, you know, in the next decade are going to be, and how EU studies should plug into this. So for me, there is the Schmittian, the Weberian, and the Tocquevillian question. The Schmittian question has been with us, of course, but is more important than ever. This beauty contest that we've seen between systems, between political systems, around both the mitigation of the crisis and vaccine politics and all of that. On one hand, this will be magnified into an interstate systemic rivalry that we're only seeing the beginning of. And the question for the EU globally is going to be how we navigate this kind of schizophrenic position between championing global planetary politics, if I can use this term. We're in a project on planetary politics with Ian Manners these days, on one hand, and the huge push for decoupling on the other, vis-a-vis China. And of course, there are two directions in that. One is to show under what conditions our system work, both at the national level and at the EU level, echoing what Sergio just talked about. Although I'm not entirely in agreement with you, Sergio, that the recovery fund is only national. I think there's a lot of dimensions in it that are about interconnections and synergies, but we could have that conversation. So on one hand, how do we understand the way our different political systems deliver, are fit for purpose? And on the other, how do we make sure that, you know, democratic values against authoritarian values are not baked in particular global institutions and global regimes? So that's the kind of the two domains. And in that context, what will be Europe's position? We're always on this question of alliance of democracies or alliance for democracies, as Biden has just reframed it. How do we get out of this difficult spot? We're not a neutral power as Europe. And this will dictate our relevance to the multilateral agenda. Probably not Europe as a model, although there are elements of it, maybe Europe as an inspiration, but in a big way, and this is an issue that Markus is also very interested in, and Brigid and Sergio, all of us, you know, we all speak about differentiated integration in the EU. What are the lessons of differentiated integration for the global level, differentiated cooperation? How do we manage this? I think Europe has a comparative advantage, and we need to think about how to exploit it. So that's the Schmittian question. The second, the Weberian question, is about the role of the state-corporate society relations. And in this moment, where of the completely radical rise of the state, and you've all discussed that in your remarks, but also reliance on society, as I was saying before, and also a new take on corporations, which is both a much more adversarial take. Look at the digital tax, look at the corporate tax, on one hand, which is part of this moment, pandemic moment, when we ask more from corporation, as well as at the very same time, a kind of, you know, some people call it the Wall Street model, the question of partnership in who's going to be the guardian of a greater equity in this post-pandemic period, and realization that states can't do it without corporations. So how do we organize these new tensions, this triangle between state, corporations, and society? And there's much more to say, but I'll skip for the interest of time. So that's the Weberian question. And I think the EU will play a very important role, both as member states, sub-state and supra-state level, in adjudicating this question. And the third category of big question has to do with the Tocquevillian question. And indeed, that is the Tocqueville, not of faction, not of the analyzing short-term American politics, but indeed in reflecting on how democracy, for all its virtues, is also short-termist, and how we can make it more long-term. And I've long argued that the EU can be and should be the guardian of the long-term, precisely because it's not very democratic in the short term. And I think we've all seen and maybe said that the COVID crisis is really a climate change crisis on steroids. And if that's the case, what we always know that crisis management has always been to raise the question of preventing the recurrence of similar crises. And if that's the case, how do we rethink the European polity and the role of the EU in helping citizens, democracy, adjudicate between the short term and the long term, along the lines that Markus was discussing? Because what is politics if not about trade-offs? We all want big things. That's easy, but it's all about how we negotiate those trade-offs, how we debate them. The whole discussion on cleavages and frugals versus sovereignists is again about trade-offs. It's not about, it's right versus right. It's not about who's right and who's wrong. And so we need to rethink the role of the EU in adjudicating these trade-offs. So I'm not saying that the whole of EU studies should engage into the Schmittian, Weberian, and Tocquevillian questions, but I believe that from a bigger global perspective, these are very much the questions that are going to occupy us and the public sphere in the decade to come.
Thank you very much, Kalypso. Brigid, you get the last word of this roundtable before we turn to the question.
After all that, where to start? So let me focus on three different areas. One to do with governance and politics, one to do with collective capacity of the EU, and then thirdly, and I'm very glad that Kalypso introduced the internal, external EU dynamics. So firstly, on politics and governance, I think we have now an experiment in a form of EU governance that is different to anything we've had in the past, in the sense of, Markus rightly pointed out, the problems with the European semester and the downloading of Commission recommendations, etc., and the way in which that impacted on core state powers. But we now have an offer of incentives. So governments are and parliaments are being asked not to submit they're being asked to submit the plans, but they're being asked, what are your targets? What do you aim to achieve? What do you aim to achieve in those areas that strategically matter to the EU in terms of climate and digital? And we help you fund it. And I think that's a very different form of politics to the politics of the semester and the politics of rules. I think it's a different form of politics. So it's a laboratory. I think it'd be very interesting. And I think it's something that should be tracked. What kind of governance emerges and politics emerge from this? On politics, multi-level politics, I think we need more research, not just on the vertical, the national to the European to the national, but on that whole transnational space. There's an awful lot of politics out there that's now transnational, but we don't have a lot of empirical data on its impact or how it operates. And I again was very struck during the framing of the COVID crisis, the intensity with which the Italian Prime Minister addressed the German public opinion, time and time again, op-eds, interviews, etc., etc. So in other words, the domestic political processes have been prized open, and there's a new space, and I'm not sure that we yet have a good purchase on what that space is, and how this creates an additional layer. So it's not that politics is being entirely transnationalized, but rather that politics begins at home but no longer ends there. And I think I think that's that whole transnational, not just public sphere, but the way in which politics operates in Europe, both vertically and horizontally, I think deserves attention from scholars. The second area, and that is, I hesitate to use the concept of state capacity, because the minute I talk about state capacity, then someone will say I'm equating the EU to a state, but rather the EU has now had a whole series of crises and has proved, albeit suboptimally, resilient through all those crises. And where does that leave not Europe's would-be polity, but Europe's polity? In other words, what kind of collective capacity does the EU have, either ideationally, politically, technically, in terms of what it can do, but then also how can that state capacity, its interaction with legitimacy and democracy. So that's the second, the way I think that we probably need to lift the analysis from interinstitutional, the EU, intergovernmental, supranational, to think of the collectivity and collective capacity. And then finally, on the internal, external dynamics, and we've said very little this evening about the global and international, but if you look across the challenges the EU faces on migration, digital, corporate tax, climate, then all of these have a pronounced global international dimension. And so the EU isn't a container when faced with all of these challenges. And so, as Kalypso said, what kind of Europe engages with what kind of world? And there is also closer to home Europe's relationship with its troubled neighborhood, either North Africa or the rich non-member states or Russia, all of that, and what kinds of relationships can the EU develop that are stable and fruitful across the geographic space beyond the EU member states. And I think there's also, and politically in the EU, there's a very inchoate and contested attempt at the moment to define something European sovereignty, open strategic autonomy, how Europe deals with a world of hard geopolitics. And again, I think it's very powerful that a French president uses concepts like European sovereignty, because if one thinks back to de Gaulle, it would be inconceivable that de Gaulle would marry sovereignty in Europe. In fact, his entire project was to say no. So why is that happening? I think that's happening because of the fundamental shifts, the inflection points we have in world politics today, where there's the competition between systems that Kalypso identified. There's the Henry Farrell-Newman argument about weaponized interdependence. And there's also the deep structural changes in power relations and in the nature of the global system. So I think that the internal and external is breaking down in an EU context because of so many of the challenges include Europe, but go beyond Europe. And it's a question of capacity to shape.
Thank you very much, Brigid. Thank you all. I took a lot of notes and I'm still thinking through a lot of things that you brought up in the conversation. So I'm now looking at the questions, which you should hopefully be able to see as well. 3 of them are a little bit on the same topic, so I'll try to it's the first come first serve basis for the questions, but I'll group them together. And these are questions related to the SGEU joint borrowing issue. So the first one was by Markus Averland, asking Brigid, but also in the light of what Markus said, will this joint borrowing stay temporary? What might change the equation? And this question came up again in a question by Jonathan Zeitlin, who also asked, I'm just using their words, right? I'm hopefully not, and I'll try to be true to their words. Will the next generation EU measures be clearly temporary one-offs? In the first instance, how much impact on the future? Can we expect the creation of European safe assets on a large scale? The eventual creation of new EU-owned resources? So that's Jonathan Zeitlin. And there was another question by Tiziano Gagaga from University of Constance and Louis, also asking, are the coalitions who were in favor of this temporary anti-crisis solution, among them Germany, or those probably not Germany, who would support a true change in the EU's fiscal paradigm with a further transfer of competencies to the EU and a real EU power to tax? How do you change the fiscal paradigm if the main supporters of the existing paradigms are not in favor of that change? So these 3 questions are about, are we typically, okay, so is this SGEU just a one-off, or and you both, Brigid and Sergio, you talked about shifting coalitions, about, so that's the first set of questions. Then there are more, I would say, even more profound questions. I'm going back to the list now. One was about this idea of the EU having core state powers. So a question from an anonymous, a spectator anonyme, that's all I can read. So an anonymous person saying, how much as you become involved in life and death issue with the COVID, basically. And I assume that this anonymous person thinks that if you actually get involved in this, even in an exceptional crisis, is somehow as a different kind of importance as well. Which leads me to I'm now realizing I'm doing this out of order. Amy Verdun said nobody talked about the vaccines. So on the one hand, there's this person asking about, core state power and the EU getting involved in life and death issues. And Amy Verdun's question was, I think, more skeptical about the fact that, if things go wrong, member states can still blame the EU for things that go bad and fail. Did they do the right thing with the vaccines? Was that, so there's the two questions are almost parallel, right? One saying the EU got involved in life and death issues, and Amy more skeptical, saying that in fact it's actually a way to be able to be the object of blame avoidance, right? Of just saying the EU did a bad job. Last but not least, Thomas Christiansen asking a question to Markus, actually, also related to the recovery package, actually, and Next Generation EU, but saying that I'm very pleased to hear Markus's positive assessment of the reemergence of a transnational community in the EU. But what about the fact that there's more societal fragmentation within member states, with perhaps minorities, but people being discontent and mobilizing against lockdowns or protocols or vaccination. So that's, if you have more transnational solidarity, on the one hand, how do you take into account, I'm now interpreting Thomas's question, polarization within member states? That's already a lot of questions so yes, who wants to take this up? Sorry, I'm reading the questions and talking to you at the same time. It's not ideal, but I hope I was clear in these questions. Who wants to pick up on this question of first, Next Generation EU, and whether it's a one-off or not? Brigid, perhaps, or?
Okay, since so firstly, temporary can last a very long time. So in other words, I can't imagine that this would be redefined as something permanent for a very long time, but we shouldn't underestimate how long temporary can be. And so that's one thing. Secondly, I think a lot will depend on the response of the financial markets, and they're likely to regard these bonds as very safe. And the world out there is looking for safe assets. And so that also fulfills the EU need to strengthen its capital markets union, and particularly in light of Brexit and the loss of the city, and also the international role of the euro, to protect itself against potentially the US weaponizing the dollar. So there are, and if you imagine the amount of money involved that the EU is placing on demanding of the markets, then you can't drain the markets of that amount of money easily. So my view is, yes, temporary, but temporary can last a very long time. And I also think that it has opened a debate on own resources, and that we will see an enhancement of the non-national contribution part of own resources. It'll be highly contested. It's not clear to me what forms of EU level tax beyond plastic that we will end up with, but I think that is something for the next 10 years. And so, yes, temporary, but as I said, temporary could well last 50 years, by which time it's no longer temporary. So I think a lot, there's the actual performance of this matters, both it's whether or not it enables the European economies to have a reasonable post-COVID bounce, that will help, but also the way in which the markets will receive these bonds. And also it may just be so attractive for the EU to have a safe asset that there would be compelling reasons to stretch it out. So I think it's really out there, and it will depend on a whole lot of contingencies. So I wouldn't predict, but I do think there is an opportunity.
Can I just a footnote to what Brigid said, and very much a functionalist argument, that once we have the recovery fund, which it will require own resources because states will not want, they could repay it on their national budget, but they won't want for obvious reasons. And own resources will be addictive, or in other words, functionally self-perpetuating, because they will fulfill at least three functions. One is that they will help legitimize the expenditure of the EU based on wealth generated by the EU. This is a point Miguel Maduro and others have made. So we visibly a link between that wealth generated by the EU, such as corporate tax and EU spending, replacing a logic that has become poisonous, as Brigid was just saying, that of the transfer of poison of the EU. So there is a connection there, that it will limit the extent of liability of citizens of one state for the spending of citizens of another. But it will also help correct, social imbalances, social contracts that can no longer be dealt at the national level. And it will perhaps be a way to use EU taxes and EU spending to improve democratic, cognition in the EU. It will have a pedagogical effect, at least if you do it the right way. So there are functions that will be valued over time that will, in addition to simply questions of the place of the global currency, etc., will make this logic self-perpetuating, I believe.
Thank you, Kalypso. Who wants to answer about life and death versus being the EU being the one to blame if vaccines?
Yeah, I can join in on this. Just a word on the temporary nature of the recovery instrument. I would like to join in the chorus of harmony. I think what we should just not think is that it will simply be perpetuated. I think we agree on this, but what it creates is a fantastic opportunity structure. We have a safe asset. It has shown that EU debt is actually possible. It's not politically toxic. And perhaps under these conditions, a clear European value added where we do not have this asymmetry of problem structure. This is, I think, where we can expect this, and as I think both Brigid and Kalypso said, if you have that opportunity to go for European debt, it's a great incentive, on these life and death issues. I think it's a kind of twin question to the vaccines. I mean, the EU getting involved in life and death issues. The question is what involved really means. The EU is also involved in life and death issues if it goes on military missions. Also, it's not usually European citizens, I think the question here is really very much this attributability. I do not know whether you can say this in English, but I'm sure that you understand me. What my perception of the public debate is very much that national politicians still very much claim responsibility for life and death issues. That is this old security function of the state. And if you wish, I think it's really this good insights from the realist in international relations that life and death issues, this is what national politicians try to claim. The same is true with this issue on the vaccine story. I mean, I think it seems to be clear that the EU has made the vaccines cheaper. We shouldn't forget that. It has helped a lot. When you look in retrospect, I think the comprehensive history of the vaccine is not being written, but probably this story that you somehow see again in the media, all the praise goes to the national and all the blame goes to the European, is not true de facto, but it sticks, obviously. And I think that points to the problem that the EU has. It will probably go into some kind of fiscal capacity, but this attribution of the blame being present in 27 media discourses is a structural problem of the EU. That, I think, somehow remains.
Thank you. Sergio, there was also, can I turn to you to this question on, which was addressed to Markus, but there was one for you on sectionalism, but this notion of, again, I put it in dichotomic terms of, yes, maybe some transnational community, but on the other hand, more polarization within member states. And I'm adding a question to you, which is about your argument about sectionalism, about its basis. Is it about the structural conditions in the countries of these sections? So I'm turning to you now on this issue.
Thanks. Let me start with Jonathan. I owe an answer to him. Of course, the division that I were talking about emerged because after the first weeks, everybody understood last year, the first week of the crisis, understood that we were facing not an health sanitary crisis, but much more significant a pandemic. At that point, it became clear that the consequences, the economic consequences of the pandemic would be of a gigantic scale. So the interpretation of the crisis, how to govern the crisis, and so forth, were connected to the let's say to the question of the economic consequences. So yes, you are right. I think it's important to stress this point. The second, again, regarding Fulvio, regarding sectionalism, I think is interesting, at least for me, is also important theoretically to see some sectional feature in the European Union, because that would push us to understand better the nature of the division within the European Union. Because if we think in terms of intergovernmental national idiosyncrasies, we have difficulty to understand the depth of the division. So, for example, in my analysis of before, that I did before, I think the division between the frugal coalition and the solidarity coalition might be breached in a new kind of form of governance. The frugal coalition accept the rule of law, accept all the acquis communautaire, respect the most important decisions. So there is no a significant divide regarding the legitimacy of the European Union. The divide is regarding the organization of the European Union. And so at that scale, I think we can have answer to that division. However, the division between the sovereignty coalition and of course there are sovereignty sections, the sovereignty groups also within the rest of the EU. The sovereignty coalition and the rest of the EU is a more problematic division. I don't know if that division can be easily breachable within the same organization. And it seems to me that the sovereignty leaders, especially the Hungarian and Polish prime minister, are pushing for something that is incompatible with, I would say, with the treaty, with the basic structure of the treaty. They think to something like APEC or ASEAN, where states with different regime can cooperate economically, where this is not the case for the European Union. Anyway, to think in sectional terms would prepare us to envision solution for this kind of division. Finally, Tiziano, here again, I think the easy answer is Italy. The possibility to transfer, to change the fiscal paradigm depend on the success of Next Generation EU. And the success of Next Generation EU, the proper utilization of the funds received from the EU authority, the success of Next Generation EU depends on how Italy will be successful with Mario Draghi. is a question of trust, is a question of, let's say, reliability. So if Italy is successful, if Italy is able to use those funds in a proper way to modernize and to open up a process of, let's say, convergence, at the same time to oppose, as Mario Draghi clearly said, the ordo-liberal mantra of Mr. Schauber. So this is a very thin position. You cannot go back to the previous position. You need to move on, and you need to use, in the case of Italy, these funds in a proper way. Then I think the context, the psychological context of the negotiation on EMU reform, because the question is more the next generation EU, in my view, is EMU reform, because in 2023, you will have the starting of the discussion on what to do with the Stability and Growth Pact. So if Italy is successful, and I think other cases are successful as well, probably the EMU reform would help to create that kind of context that Markus and Brigid talk about, namely the possibility to make Next Generation EU a long temporary program, helping the member states to re-enter in the economic condition that they had in the 2010s. So, but this is let's say, the outcome of a political process, and I would say that Italy in this case has the crucial word. And I think if Italy is unable to do this question, to resolve this problem with Mario Draghi, then means that it's impossible to resolve those problems. Okay.
Thank you, Sergio. Italy is the key. That's a nice conclusion. There were a couple more questions. Unfortunately, I think it's already 7 p.m. Just a few things I want to say. First, thank you so much. As I said, I learned so much from, I have, ideas bubbling in my mind from your various contributions, and I'm sure other participants work like me. The conference has been recorded and live streamed, so people will be able to enjoy it who were not able to be there live. I really want to thank you. I could have asked you tons of questions about, actually probably in my own strange French way, about things that did not happen and dogs that did not bark in this strange period, because I think Kalypso mentioned it and a couple of you, is the EU as a global actor. Well, not so sure. I don't think included with, so beyond COVID. So there are still some interesting questions to discuss, but we have to close tonight. I really want to thank you for all of you and all the conference participants. We have a second plenary tomorrow. The Journal of European Integration has invited Vivian Schmidt in Rome, live in Rome, so with actual people in an actual aula, classroom, and it will be also, of course, live streamed and for the conference. And I really thank you, thank the four of you for, I think, complementary, but I think there was, as Markus said, sometime some harmony, some convergent views, which means that all the work that we've done in EU studies, sometimes we, we're not, we can still build on what we know about how this institutional system functions, and it's still valid in 2021. So I really thank you very much, and to all the conference participants, stay tuned. General Assembly, 12:30 tomorrow, and the plenary lecture with Vivian after the panel. So enjoy the conference, and thank you very much to all of you and to our four scholars.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.